Hello, everyone. Welcome to connectedlearning.tv and our weekly webinar and Google Hangout. I'm Jeff Brazil. I'm with the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub. We do these sessions each week featuring presentations and conversations with leaders in connected learning. This is our 26th webinar in the series, and to date, people from 90 countries have viewed and participated in the sessions. I'm excited today personally, and we are excited at the Hub to have Steve Hargadon, who's going to lead us in a conversation today about the social narrative of today's and tomorrow's education system, and address what shifts in education will and should we see in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And I'd have a hard time imagining a greater person to have that conversation with than Steve. I really enjoyed getting to know him in recent years. Joining Steve in the Google Hangout is a great group of experts who will introduce themselves in a moment. If you're participating on live stream, we would strongly encourage you to use the chat to connect with one another, to share links and resources and ideas and questions. We'll do our best to pull all the questions from the chat into the group so we can address your questions. And by now, our community manager, John Baraloni, who's out there in the chat sphere, should have put a link to a public Google Doc in the stream that we use for collective note-taking and resource sharing and just ideas. And the more people participate in that, we find that the richer the sessions are. So I want to encourage you to do that as well. Before we let Steve kind of start us off today, I wanted to give each of our Hangout guests a moment to kind of briefly introduce themselves and their work, and also what their interest and intersection is with today's topic. Let's start with you, Audrey.
Hi, I'm Audrey Waters. I run a website called Hack Education, where I cover sort of news and analysis about education technology. I do track a lot of the new startups that we're seeing, and that's hopefully something we can talk about today, sort of this sort of renewed interest in the industry in rethinking what education and technology looks like. But I definitely I'm pretty critical of that space. I do a weekly podcast with Steve where we tend to sort of gnash our teeth, I think, a lot at these sorts of issues. So I'm excited to be here.
Teeth gnashing is good. Brian?
Well, I'm not going to gnash my teeth, but I will wave. Hello. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the Senior Fellow at the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education. I'm coming to you this morning from Vermont. And I spend most of my time working on the future of higher education, especially as technology impacts it. I do this through a variety of means, mostly all over the web and in person. I'm also very happy to be here.
Thanks, Brian. Monica?
I've had the privilege to be in an incubated space listening to kids without an agenda on how they would redefine school the last 4 years. And Steve's work, specifically with the future of education, has been just huge to that piece. 2 things in particular: the ability to lurk and the ability to connect to unlikely connections, and his eclectic gathering of interviewees that he's brought has me reading books, a couple books a week, probably. And to the point to where, 4 years ago when we started, my kids were referring to him as the Oprah of public education. So I can't thank him enough for getting us directed to the right questions. So I think this is, like you said, Jeff, this is a great session to be a part of.
Yeah, the Oprah is probably a pretty good title, but I'll go ahead and read his official his official description. Steve is director of the Web 2.0 Labs, host of the Future of Education interview series, which I strongly recommend you dive into if you haven't, chair of the Learning 2.0 Conference and the Social Learning Summit, and co-chair of the annual Global Education and Library 2.0 Worldwide Conferences. He has pioneered both the use of social networking in education, has created now 70,000 member Classroom 2.0 social network, and a massive peer-to-peer professional development of his conferences. He's supported and encouraged the development of thousands of other education networks and events, especially for professional development. And just on a personal note, I've had the privilege of having a couple of conversations with Steve starting in March of this year on this topic. And he's done a lot of thinking about something that's really important, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So Steve, you're up.
Thanks so much. It's really fun to be here with such good friends. And Brian, I'm so jealous. It looks like you're on a treadmill, and I've wanted to do that forever. And if you are, way to go, dude. Okay, so I really love the image that you used for this session. It was kind of like the Addams Family take on a classroom, right? I mean, I could see the cobwebs and the chairs not being used. We're clearly going through a cultural renegotiation about what school is about. But I worry that the conversation that we're having, the one we're having today, is actually quite limited. And that the larger conversation about the future of education is actually not the same conversation that we're having. I don't get invited to Education Nation, nor do any of the people that I really am interested in. There are these sort of national dialogues around education that really seem to center on very different topics than the ones we discuss. So I'm thinking that we're possibly having, even in this sort of echo chamber, maybe the wrong conversation. I want to propose that today. And it's after over 300 interviews and easily as many books that I've come to this conclusion, but I'm willing to be challenged, and I'm interested in sort of the response to this. And I'll introduce it by telling a story. So in my grandfather's last years, I took care of him, my wife and I did. And he developed pneumonia, and we took him to the hospital. And it was at UC Davis, which is a teaching hospital, and so it's a place where they're learning as much as practicing medicine. And he was admitted, and I had made note of the fact that he was allergic to sulfur-based antibiotics, but it somehow didn't get through, and got to the hospital the next day. I think it was the next day, and he had a large ulcer that had developed on his arm. And the doctors had switched by that time, and there was a different doctor, and I had a visit with the doctor, and he sort of described my grandfather's situation and what they were doing, and he was completely unaware of the pneumonia, and the sole work at that point was believing that he had come in with the skin ulcer. And I thought that was really interesting because I had to remind them of the actual core problem. And I'm wondering if we're maybe in the same trap, which is there are things that demand our attention, that seem compelling, that we can work on, but they may not actually be the core problem. And I think if that's true, that what we're trying to do is to fix a compliance and control system rather than advocating a belief in agency and self-reliance. And that a lot of the activity we're seeing, especially the Silicon Valley activity, seems to be focused, what I think, on maybe on the wrong symptom. Okay, so we'll definitely jump from there. This week I interviewed Ron Walk, who's on the board at Big Picture Learning, a fascinating book he wrote called Wasting Minds. Great description of the problems with current schooling, and then a really compelling view of what school could be, and a potential for change, in which he describes a system of choice and a parallel set of schools that grow up and kind of become this disruptive innovation to schooling. I really liked it. And in the course of interviewing him in the conversation, he said, we were really looking for somebody of public stature who could help us change the public narrative on education. And he mentioned that, the Colin Powell was a name that had come up. And I thought, I had a realization at that moment that I don't think that change will actually come that way. There's a conversation amongst, we'll call it the elite, but those who are, thoughtful, interested people. But the truth is that that particular conversation is not likely, in my mind, to actually change what takes place. And my final story relates to this. So there's a great conference called EduCon that takes place every year in Philadelphia. Chris Lehman at Science Leadership Academy heads this up. And I've gone to EduCon for several years, and I've been sort of intrigued at what takes place there. There's often a real desire to see change in education, but it's wanting the system to stay a system, but to reflect a different set of beliefs. And I think this is what Ron was kind of doing with looking for a Colin Powell-like figure, which is we still want a top-down system. We still want it to be the system that it is. We just want to change the practices of the system, right? And my guess is that that's not really realistic, right? That inherently people of thoughtful people are going to disagree for very good reasons. I mean, it's a complex issue. And the likelihood that some new sort of ideas about how to run education will overtake the old ideas is still a system of ideas that's sort of implemented from top down. So I wanted to define for myself what are my core beliefs. What are the things I really care about? What's the pneumonia issue? What are the pneumonia issues for me rather than the skin ulcer? And that just sounds terrible, but I think you get the point, right? So I'm going to list them, and then we can kind of go from there. So first for me is an inherent belief in the worth and value of every child. Right? We tell a huge number of kids and their parents that they are defective, that they have failed. And this isn't just kids in poverty, it's then just kids in certain ethnic groups. Our son struggled in school, and we were essentially told that he had deficiencies, and here was how these deficiencies were going to be addressed. And I don't think that I believe that. In fact, I know I don't believe that. I don't believe that's a good outcome of the system. So I believe in the worth and inherent value of every child. I also believe in agency. That is that the ultimate goal of education should be to develop the ability for students to take responsibility for their own lives and become increasingly self-directed. And in my own parenting, I know that I'm in a control or force and compliance mode, that I'm using dangerous shortcuts. And I think our system is not based on agency ultimately. I don't think the core belief is to help people become independent self-learners. I think the core belief generally reflects this idea of creating a standardized outcome. And I'm willing to get pushback on that. The third belief for me is that is in the value of learning. That learning helps us to lead better lives by overcoming our biases, by overcoming simplistic thinking, by overcoming cognitive errors. If we look at the jury system or we look at the balance of powers, I think there's this deep understanding that as human beings, we need to overcome sort of the inherent flaws of how we operate, and that learning does that in a really brilliant way. It helps us overcome our myopia or our own perspective or emotions. I watch the conventions on television, and I have to say, the level of emotional appeal actually really turns me off. I'm much more interested in the ideas and the sense that playing loud music and people dancing with funny hats is a reason to believe in a particular party platform is not attractive to me at all. And I feel like learning has, the Socratic practice, liberal arts, the liberal arts tradition are about kind of becoming better through learning. Okay, and then my final belief is in the value of participation. And I think that's the role I play, in a lot of ways in this community, as a non-educator, as a person who's homeschooled children, I'm probably, a little bit out of the mainstream in this dialogue. But I think one of the things that I do really offer is, in addition to sort of being another perspective, is that I think I'm good at bringing people together and respecting the value of that activity without having to direct it. So the virtual conferences, the social EduCon, these kinds of things, I think they're really important. And it's not just important for students to be engaged, because of course it is, but I think we're learning now that it's really important for educators to be engaged in their professional development. And we're remembering that, and we're remembering the importance of people being engaged. And at a core level, our narrative around democracy is a narrative of participation, right? It's not the best. Doesn't mean that that in every circumstance you fly in the most profoundly learned people to discuss with your city council what's taking place. It's the fact that the local people have a discussion and work things out locally. And I think that's a really important and key element when we think about education. And it worries me when we talk about the best teachers and showcasing the best lectures, when in fact, education for me is largely an act of participation. And my own participation in the blogosphere and in social media over the last 5 years have really produced a tremendously different sense for me of my potential and my role. And I think that's what excites a lot of us about social media and Web 2.0 in education is that possibility. So taking those stories and those core beliefs and adding them all together, I announced last night I'm actually going to do a several city by city tour. I may get 3 people who show up in each city, but my goal is to hold substantive conversations around education and with those particularly who are dispossessed, because I don't think it's going to be a Colin Powell movement right now to get us past those dusty chairs in the schoolhouse. But I think it has to be a larger kind of Martin Luther King, Gandhi-like movement for those who are dispossessed, for whom the system really tells them things that are not true about themselves, to see education in a very different way, and to not feel that their children are defective, or at least to have some ability to own their own educational path. So I'll stop there, and Jeff, let you guide us.
No, I appreciate especially the approach with stories. It's very helpful for people. I wanted to give each of the experts in the Hangout a chance to respond to Steve, to his opening remarks and the stories, and then we'll move to some questions that are coming in. Audrey, you want to start us off?
Yeah, there's a lot I want to respond to. I think one of the things that I think about a lot, particularly as we're having these national conversations with a lot of hand-wringing about what education, sort of the state of our education system, is I think that we need to have some serious conversations about what is the purpose of education. And I think, because I think that as your comments really highlighted, Steve, there's a divide between an education system, right, whether that's a federal system or state, local districts, school system, sort of systemic things that happen in an institution, and then this question of learning. And interestingly, although education purports to be an institution about learning, and systemically it's supposed to provide everyone with opportunities for that, I think that we don't often have conversations about the learning piece. We seem to have a lot of conversations about the system. And I think that that's probably why this question of agency comes up continually in our conversations, is because in some ways, individual agency, individual discovery sort of collides with sort of systemic institutional planning. And I think that the role that technology is playing now and in the future as well, we're really going to see that conflict, particularly when we hear this talk of personalization, personalized learning, adaptive learning, that's supposed to, so the marketing speak goes at least, sort of provide you with opportunities that are individualized to your needs, when really it's actually the standardized body of curriculum that's being given, parsed out in little pieces to you. So I think that this question of agency and system, standardization and personalization run right through some of the problems that we see in education right now.
Jeff, can I ask Audrey a question?
Yes.
So Audrey, do you think I'm close on this idea of who holds that conversation? Meaning, if the conversation about the purpose of education takes place at the EduCon or Steve Hargadon level, is that actually going to create the kind of change that we're looking for, or does the conversation need to be taken down to the much more grassroots level?
I think we do need to have, I think we need to have conversations at all levels. I mean, I think that we are, I mean, sort of the story about pointing to someone like Colin Powell, I think, is actually one of the problems that we have with thinking about the way in which power works, because we like to look at sort of the people in charge and we think that they're the ones with power. But I think that power is more complicated than that. And I think it isn't just the president or Arnie Duncan or your state, whoever the head of your education is in your state. I think that there are lots of ways in which influence occurs, but I do think we need to have more of these grassroots conversations, have them with teachers, but have them with parents, and have them, for crying out loud, with students. Students seem to be missing from a lot of these conversations where we're sort of they're just these sort of lab rats that we have conversations about them, but never really with them. And this is
Here,
their
here.
education.
Hey, Brian, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of respond to some of these opening remarks.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Great. Gosh, going after Audrey, I feel like I just want to plug her blog and podcast and say, yeah, this is great. Another person with hair. But uh, I I really liked your opening remarks, Stephen. I just want to touch on a couple of them. I want to amplify a couple and push back on one. And the pushback is control. I think you're absolutely right to identify this dynamic of top-down control versus a kind of anarchic DIY self-responsibility, autodictate kind of learning. And I run into this in my work when I go to campuses and speak to educational technologists and leading edge faculty who talk about the radical nature of their work, how they're destabilizing education. And then when I talk to a president, a dean, or a chief financial officer, and they talk about staying the course and how everything is under control. But what complicates your picture is that in American education, there's so much distribution of control. I mean, in K through 12, we have, of course, alongside national work and state level work, we have very independent states and we have local rule. Um, I'm in Vermont right now, and we actually have a tradition of town governance, and we are very active in that. And I don't mean a political class, I mean average everyday folk. Um, I know Mark Twain famously said God created idiots first, that was for practice, then he created school boards. But school boards are really hugely influential. So as Audrey said, the question of power is complicated. In higher education, of course, it's even more distributed. We celebrate the autonomy of faculty, which usually means the dwindling minority of faculty who actually have tenure or tenure track. But that's still central to faculty governance and to a lot of campus work. In my sector, in liberal education, campuses pride themselves on their independence, their uniqueness. So I think control is a little more complicated. Let me amplify one point and then leave an elephant on the table. I think when you talk about the power of agency, I think that's absolutely critical. And I think that's where technology really threatens command and control. I think that from the 60s, we inherited two different modes of thinking about technology. One was the idea of technology as the HAL 9000 model, the Colossus, the Forbidden Project model, the great brain that will control everybody. And many adults, especially boomers and seniors above them, still have that model. But we also have the DIY point of view, the whole earth catalog point of view. And that's the one that's really changed the world in many ways. And I think that's a threat explicitly as well as implicitly to much of education. But I think you're too gentle on the question of agency. I think right now politics is moving strongly to crush agency even further. On the one hand, many education reformers urge more data, more control, more regulation, but also the defenders of a lot of public education urge more control. There's the defending teacher autonomy, defending schools. It's a very siege mentality mode, and I rarely hear anybody defending schools talking about empowering students to make their own mind up. The elephant in the room here, of course, is at least in the United States, we have this dire combination of politics and economics that's putting more stress on education than any time since the 1930s. I think that's really something that we need to address. I mean, both the combination of the politics I just mentioned, the cultural shift where education has a lower amount of support, lower status than before. Steve, you mentioned homeschooling. I'm another homeschooler too. Education as a profession has really slipped down. And in this economy, it's very hard to ask for more resources to be devoted to education. So control, agency, and big honking elephant.
Thanks, Brian. Monica, I want to give you a chance, and then we have a bunch of questions coming in that we'll go to.
I think a lot of the stuff's been said. I think that what Audrey said about it's all the conversations. I think possibly the grassroots conversation is the one that's not quite legitimatized. So I see that as a big venue for you, Steve, in your traveling. and listening to student voices. As me personally experiencing this over the last 4 years, hanging out with Steve's Future of Ed and redefining for myself what learning means, that it is a perpetual beta, and experiencing that for myself, and also practicing that agency myself, and speaking with kids and parents and admin and teachers in our district. It's amazing how many people think it's not legal to think for yourself. So yeah, all going back and forth, the gyration from the top-down conversation to the grassroots conversation is huge. That movement is huge for us to see the big picture. But perhaps helping people to realize that self-conversation every day, and then your local conversation within your community, that those are legitimate, and we need to be having those and starting at the very basics. I do want to add one thing for your very first thing about the deficiency, making sure that people realize that they're valued. The other angle also, helping people to realize that they have false accolades. So we're claiming some people are deficient, but we're also claiming some people are spot on when they have 4.0s and they really don't know how to have any agency. So I think that false accolade needs to be addressed as well.
Thanks, Monica. The first question coming in is about another elephant in the room, the assessment system of testing. And that really is identified by the questioner as one of the deficiencies that you're referencing, Steve. And the question is very simply, how can this be changed?
So this is tricky because I can't, I'm tempted to see this question as being one of treating the skin ulcer, meaning, yes, that the testing assessment, the assessment system of testing identifies deficiencies. I don't know that you could change that without changing the core beliefs behind why we're in school. So I'm not really quite sure how to answer that. I mean, I guess my answer would be, good, I'll let Brian answer, probably do a better job than I am. I guess my answer would be finding new narratives and identifying our core beliefs about what education is, rather than trying to shift to another system. I mean, I hear all kinds of great responses about personalization and programs that people are running. And then people are doing great work, there's no question about it, but if it's still within the construct of a top-down model, I'm concerned that it doesn't actually change the larger core set of beliefs or narratives. Brian, please do a better job than I just did.
Oh, not at all. I think the vertical dimension is crucial, and I don't think it's going away. I mean, I think we will just see what we're seeing right now in the public sphere is a competition for which vertical narrative to impose. Do we want to have a pro-STEM narrative? Do we want to have moral values inculcated? Do we want to have civic citizenship? I mean, it's really, I think what we can do is celebrate the horizontal form of assessment, the kind that we've learned through the open web and through social media. So think about projects like the Mozilla Open Badges project as a way of assessing learner work. If we think about giving students, for some students, you have to give them the right to use social media. For others, it's recognizing their social media presence so that they can basically share with the world what they're doing. You can do this through portfolios or e-portfolios if you want, but to give students their own domains, to give students blogs, to incorporate that in learning, that's a way of, that is a form of portfolio assessment. It's just open to the world, and one that can be assessed beyond the confines of the school.
Yeah, go ahead, Audrey.
Now it's my turn to say a ditto to what Brian said, but because I want to build on that and say that this ties back to one of the things that you were saying earlier, Steve, about participation and more broadly about community. And I think that we do have opportunities, particularly with, as Brian says, sort of a web, thinking about technology as a web, as a network of humans, and not necessarily sort of just the technology or machine piece. That really when we're sort of when we're sort of performing our work online for others in an open space, there's assessment happens all the time. It just doesn't look like the sort of the ways in which we think traditionally have thought of testing and assessment to happen in a classroom. And so I do think in some ways it's just a matter of sort of reframing and recognizing that we are assessed, we assess other humans all the time. We assess, traffic when it's safe to cross the street. We make these sort of judgments all the time, and to help students recognize that that they can participate and be part of an online of sort of a world online that makes assessment seem less about what do you know in this moment on this test, and who are you, and what do you have to share, and what can you say and build with other people.
Monica?
And I'd like to push it even more. And I mean, maybe that is even one of the issues that's getting in our way, that we're focused on having to prove things. What if having to prove things is causing all the policy and causing all the prep work for things that don't matter? And so again, back to people believing it's not legal for them to think for themselves. Maybe self-assessment is the only thing that really matters, and we trust people enough to do that. I think it would be very intriguing to have spaces where people don't think when they wake up every day about how many badges or how many accolades they're going to get that day, and instead they're just thinking about what matters, and they're spending their time doing that.
Steve, I think you had a tag on this.
I did, and I've appreciated all the comments. I don't think that the idea of owning the learning is any less rigorous. In fact, I think schools like Big Picture Schools or the Met kind of show that when the student owns the learning, it can be more rigorous. And I worry that sometimes in this conversation that it sounds like we're trading rigor for freedom, but I actually think that that's not necessarily the case. And so, there are good answers to this question, which is there are schools that do like Big Picture Schools, where you actually, I can't remember what they call the actual showcase of the work. That's an alternative to assessment. But I worry that if we look to systematize an alternative to the assessment, that we're falling into the same trap.
I wanted to turn to this next issue, and this is referencing, Steve, your journey across America. And the question is, tell us a bit about this journey across America to discuss educational change, and what are some of the goals that you have or expectations before you set out on this journey?
Okay, so if you want to see my blog post on this, you can go to hackyoureducation.com, and it just forwards to the blog post, which I posted last night. The idea is to use this as an opportunity for me to learn. I don't know that I fully understand how to enable this potentially grassroots movement, and I'd like to figure that out. And so my goal is to have meetings in these different cities with people and say, what are the touch points for you? What are the things that you care about? How do we define this narrative in such a way that it resonates with you and makes a difference? So the idea is to have a Friday night session, which I'm currently calling Your Child is Not Deficient. And the idea being that there are a large group of people for whom that message of their children being deficient or a failure, or the student getting that message, is significantly disempowering. I don't know how to gather the people who are experiencing that, and so part of the idea is to try and figure that out. And then on Saturday, I'm holding what I am calling the Hack Your Education session, which is just a way for students, teachers, parents, administrators to learn how to use the web to capture and magnify their own personal interests and passions. So looking at building a personal learning network and a personal learning environment, how you curate your digital profile. I do believe these tools are inherently powerful in what they can provide. We've heard Audrey and Monica, I think, both talk well to that. So that will be an all-day session. And what I did is I just sat down with my wife and said, hey, we're going to get in the car and we're going to go. Where shall we go? And people have emailed me already. Well, you didn't include this city, or there's no city in the South. Well, there was no intention to exclude anybody, The idea is just to do it in enough places to begin to get a sense of can we hold a sort of like the new Lyceum, right? The Lyceum movement of educational activities in different cities the Transcendentalists were involved in. Can we hold that kind of a meeting? And what does it take to hold a public community meeting on education that is civil and thoughtful and constructive rather than sort of playing into the current ways in which education is being talked about publicly?
Brian's comments earlier about the horizontal aspect being critical, and Steve, your thread here on the defective child makes me think of a story that I just read. You may have already read it, all of you. In Mother Jones, there's a reporter that's immersed in a school in San Francisco, and she has this great story about this youth who is told that in terms of interacting with the system, is told from the beginning, she's an immigrant youth, that she's defective, that she'll never succeed, and that her future is sort of planned out for her, just based on demographics and these sorts of things. And it's a terrific story. I would encourage you to read it on motherjones.com. If anyone has a link, please share it. But anyway, it's a teacher, really, it's a teacher and this youth who work horizontally together and overcome, and it has a great ending. Where she's headed is terrific. But it makes me, both your comments about horizontal aspect being very, very important and critical, because we're in control of that, right? And we have the agency there. And Steve, your comment about the defectiveness message that people hear over and over again made me think of that story. We had another question coming in. And Steve, this is addressed to you, but please anyone weigh in. It's specifically on how social media can be used by teachers to create change. I mean, what is it that teachers can do in and of themselves with the tools that exist right now that can bring about some of the changes that people are thirsty for?
So for me, that question gets answered at two levels, and one of which, again, is kind of the level of, can we do something to create a social movement, some kind of change, organizing, and the like. And I think that definitely is a good sort of secondary outcome of whatever the core belief is. My sense is that what teachers can do most right now is to model learning for their students. Right? So what social media and the web do is they allow us to become proactive learners and to take agency for our own learning and to follow and support our passions. And what I told the group before we started was, I have this skin condition called vitiligo. It's the depigmenting of your skin. It's the Michael Jackson skin disorder. And I now run the world's largest social network for people with vitiligo. And it's actually become the conduit for several vitiligo research groups who are now going to come together and join forces and use this as their network and combine their resources for research. So this isn't something I get paid for. It's something I do because I know people with vitiligo really suffer socially, especially if you're dark-skinned. And I hope that for my kids, I'm modeling sort of impassioned engagement in something that I care about. And I think that's what teachers can do. I mean, my kids want to see their teachers as human beings, and they want to model after them. So while the social movement piece I think is valuable, I think the core piece that comes before that is using these tools for ourselves and our own learning in such a way as to both model and understand the value for students. Okay, I'm going to give a quick little story here. So when I do this with educators, I'll often say, do you think it's important for students to have a digital presence or profile? Do you think it's important for them to get authentic feedback on their writing? Everybody says yes. Then I'll say, okay, so if you're modeling learning, and those are really critical things for students to be doing, are they critical things for educators to be doing? I mean, it is scary to think about putting yourself out online in a digital footprint or a portfolio and sharing your work. It's especially scary to think that you'll post things and other people might be critical of them, and you're gonna that you're writing and getting authentic feedback. But if we believe it's important for the learner, then it is critically important for the lead learner or the teacher. And this is a hard shift to make, but I think it's an important one.
Okay, so this notion of how do we use social media to be and to be the change and to make change right now is a great one. Brian, you had a comment, and then I think Monica, then Audrey.
Yeah, very quickly. In the chat box, and my quick answer to the question was so much, because I mean there's so much capacity and so many channels in social media. let me just chime in with John's story, and I'm sure we could all come up with a bunch of stories, or Steve's story rather, a bunch of stories like this, where we take passions and bring them to the web. I mean, after the dot-com collapse, Kevin Kelly said it's important to remember that the web was built out of love, not commerce. And the majority of the web was built by people who were passionate and interested in things and did it for love. Um, but a second thing I think is going back to the model of the top-down command and control stasis model, is that the web is and social media is now probably the best professional development world we have. So if teachers, sixth grade, grad school, whatever, are curious about how to teach with games, how to teach with social media, should students have their own digital media footprint, the the social media world is the best place for them to go to find peers, to find models, to find counter arguments, and for them to contribute and learn and push things back to them. The other is that the promise of the web, more than perhaps any other technology, is this idea of the read-write web, the true writing and reading back to each other. And schools haven't really grappled with this fully. We've invented technologies that trammel that or go away from it. But I think for teachers to engage and model that behavior of contributing as well as benefiting from other people's contributions, I think is the best way to embrace the spirit of the web, which is essential to the spirit of our time.
Monica?
So in the chat here, Brian made a comment earlier about that we really don't get the web. And I think that's one thing that we can do as teachers who want to be modeling learning is start swimming in the web. I think we've missed what exponentiation means, what a network means, which are mathematical thinking, but we're so focused on school math, I think we miss that. David Weinberger's book, Too Big to Know, he references the difference between a pyramid and a network. And as educators, we've come through believing in the pyramid and that sort of thing. Well, and he says the biggest difference is that the pyramid has a foundation and the network does not. And that's huge. That's huge in understanding what the web is all about and swimming in it. That when we ask the question, what about the basics? Well, in a network, there are no basics. It's very rhizomatic. You can jump in anywhere and go anywhere with it. So my advice would be to not think about technology so much, but jump in and experience what a mesh network is.
Audrey?
Yeah, and I sort of one more argument here for the web is I think that another fundamental sort of gesture is this thing about openness. When we talk about, I think open is used as an adjective in a lot of ways that we should perhaps be critical of, but I think it's important to think about, open source, opening the code, open sort of open enrollment so that anyone can join, open educational resources that we allow people to share and distribute, and particularly open access when it comes to education and that sort of process of researching and thinking and learning online in a way that's not behind a paywall, that's open. I think that there's an open-endedness to that sort of we can help people recognize that sort of the grown-ups in the room don't have all the answers, that we're exploring things, and we can sort of lay that open for people as well, so they can sort of see our process of thinking and learning and changing and growing. And I think that that openness also points to transparency, and sort of again in this process of sort of how can we sort of open things up? And really, when we talked earlier about power and politics, how can the openness of the web help crack open some of these systems in terms of the way in which money and power and influence have really dictated a lot of what's happened in the education system that's sort of behind closed doors. And I think that the open web has a real is very powerful. And I think that when we think about technology, choosing systems that are closed, I think we should be really thoughtful about what's closed and what's open, because I think that this openness in terms of education is really powerful.
The next question coming in from the stream, as we have seen in the last couple of weeks of the political conventions and the makeup of people in those organizations and Steve's idea of an education movement, how influential will the changing demographics of the country influence change in education? Who wants to tackle that one?
Am I allowed to?
Of course.
Okay, I'll go first. This is really a great conversation. Okay, so I think it's actually a really significant thing. So if we think of the degree to which institutions begin to cultivate and depend on people who perpetuate the institution, and the people who are sort of entangled and enmeshed in an institution and get value from that are unlikely to to want to make changes to the existing power structure, then I think the value in increased diversity is people who are not benefiting from that saying, this doesn't work for me, right? This existing system of tax laws or the way in which lobbyists influence policy, that doesn't actually benefit me, because the lobbyists are going to spend money to be able to accomplish goals that are beneficial to the organizations that have the money to lobby. And so the degree to which we're very bound right now in a system that those who are benefiting are increasingly making the decisions for themselves. And I'm not, I don't want to overplay this as selfishness, because I think in a lot of cases it's benign. Benign's the wrong word. It's unconscious selfishness. It's not realizing the degree to which those who are benefiting from the system are then able to manipulate the system to get increased benefits, and maybe in some cases very conscious. But I think the increased diversity provides an opportunity for this kind of a movement, and maybe that's exactly why I'm interested in it, which is those who are dispossessed, those for whom the core beliefs of individual worth and value or of learning aren't the core beliefs of the system, or aren't, those core beliefs aren't reflected in the system, are the very ones who can stand up and say, I may not have a degree from Harvard, I may not be, the best and the brightest, but I have to say this isn't my conception of what teaching and learning should be about.
Brian, I think you had a comment here too. Brian? No?
Nope. Am I on?
You're on.
Good. Very quickly, a couple of points. This is a terrific question, and it's one of the big picture questions that we have to worry about in the whole futurist world. Demographics are pretty close to destiny. They're really, really hard to change. I think one piece of this that I find fascinating is that in the US, it tends to be non-white populations that use mobile devices more than whites do. The Pew Internet and American Life keeps finding this in study after study. So I wonder, at that small level, if we won't see a greater emphasis on mobile devices, in part because increasingly whites are going to be a minority in the United States. That's one. A second, though, is that we have the big quantitative demographic bulge of the boomers, who not only have had such a central role in our culture, but are now redesigning the whole retirement, aging, and death world, which gives them tremendous, tremendous political clout. Boomers precede the web, they precede gaming, they precede social media. I don't want to get into the digital immigrants versus natives debate very much, but to say that broadly speaking, that's a huge, powerful demographic that really in many ways controls levers of power. In my worst, darkest moments, I think of this as the Soviet model. Change will happen once we have enough retirements and die-offs. I hope it doesn't come to pass. But I think the next generation that is immersed in this is at least more comfortable thinking through it. But the biggest challenge, I think, demographically, that we really don't pay enough attention to is that the world of thinking about education in America and the world of thinking about technology in America is overwhelmingly US-centric. We think that we're very broadly international if we consider Southern Canada. And it's important to realize how many innovations happen in the rest of the world, from East Asia to Africa to South America. And I think that's one of the great, great demographic challenges, is the technology has wired us up pretty well and will continue to wire us up further. The tricky part is convincing these different generations, these different demographic slices, to actually realize that there's a rest of the world out there.
Audrey and Monica, I wanted to give you guys a chance to tag up on Brian's comments or Steve's on this topic if you'd like.
I was really struck. I actually haven't been watching the political conventions. I'm a proud non-television owner, but I've been watching the responses on Twitter, sort of living vicariously through people that do watch television by watching my Twitter feeds. But thinking a lot about this question about the national conversation, the national conversations that we're hearing about education, and thinking too about, again, this question of how is that different from our very personal experiences, and how, there seems to be this sort of um, a lot of divides between what happens on a stage and the sort of large narratives that we're hearing about, the U.S. falling behind in test scores, sort of damning teachers unions, worry about, I think global competition is really the only place in which sort of the global world comes into this frame. And then thinking about people's local experiences with in their local schools, in their communities, and the way in which they learn in their, they learn and experience education in their own lives. So I do wonder sort of what happens when we have these conversations, these sort of narratives that really are so contrary, and how do we, I think that the web, again, back to the web, is a way to sort of bridge some of that and sort of fact check ourselves to sort of think about these larger political discussions that don't necessarily jive with what we experience personally.
Monica, did you have something on this, or we can move to this other question too?
That's okay. Go ahead to the next.
Okay. So the last question, I think we'll probably have time to take. We're getting towards the top of the hour. In the same way that standardized high-stakes testing has lost credibility, will Common Core suffer the same fate because its time has passed? Whoever wants to tackle that one. Any takers?
I can jump in. So I'm not an expert on Common Core, but again, I think it's a solution to the wrong problem. I mean, it does, it's like treating my grandfather's skin ulcer. It is intended to address specific problems in ways that people think solutions can happen and will have an impact, but I don't think it's the core issue. And again, not being an expert, I don't want to say too much, but I do fear that it's part of this idea that the system is intended to produce identical widgets as an output. Sugata Mitra had this great slide in the keynote he did for the Learning 2.0 conference, of identical soldiers all lined up. And I thought, this is actually true. I mean, we don't, if someone's failing in a particular class, that's the one we focus on because the goal is to get everybody to some sort of standardized output. And, the consequence of that is that it's not respectful of the individual. And so I worry the Common Core is solving the wrong problem. And you say, let's go to this.
Yeah, let's go to this last question. I think this is a great question. How do you compete? And maybe this goes to the horizontal thread that came up earlier. But how do we compete with people who have a giant megaphone with strong feelings about education and technology?
Well, so this is obviously the core driver for me right now, right? Which is, Bill Gates is an education expert, looking to certain people to solve education, especially some of the hubris coming out of Silicon Valley, and the lack of historical perspective and not understanding the core, deeper issues. So, my guess is that this is not an uncommon situation to be in. That this is in many ways defines our U.S. culture in a lot of ways, and where we have seen change, like in the civil rights movement. We've seen it come at a grassroots level. So for me, that's the competition. I don't think getting a bigger megaphone is the answer. And that's probably a good way of describing what typically tends to happen here, which is, and I've interviewed all these people who have great solutions, their own solution for how the education system should be run. But I fear that it's just, Colin Powell calling up the White House is one megaphone against another, and that's not really a solution for me.
Did anyone else have a thought on the megaphone issue? Or we can move to another question that's also, I think, quite quite timely and important.
Sure, I'll take a quick run at it. To go back to what Monica was saying, I really think we are in a kind of giant structural battle between network and command structure modes. And if we recognize that, then we recognize that the network is a huge, viewable, legitimate, and fun place to play in. And if we take advantage of that, I think that's our best way. It can be grassroots, as Steve just said, which I think is very, very important. But also, I think these two systems begin to overlap as you get teachers and administrators who are paying attention to what's happening in the networks, and as their lives becoming more networked. I think in many ways that's the best place for us to be.
Audrey?
I would just add, that I'm not afraid of them, and I think that that's like I think that to me that's the most important thing. I recognize that there are people with a great deal more power and money influence than me, but I'm not afraid of them. And I write what I want on my own domain that I own. Nobody can tell me what to do or what to say. I speak my own voice, and I'm not interested so much in getting a chunk of their pie or their power. I'm not interested in playing their reindeer games. It's my voice, and it's sort of I sound like a bit like a toddler. I'll do what I want, but I'll do what I want, and I'm really not interested in sort of chasing the way in which they've structured power. I'm much more interested in tapping into sort of these distributed ways of influencing people, and it's less about sort of their way than it is my way.
And adding to that, the whole idea of maybe asking about competition isn't the right question as well. And another piece of mathematical thinking, I think like the web, we don't understand exponentiation. And if we focused, instead of waiting for the latest innovation to scale, we scale the individual. That's exponentiation that none of us really have a grasp on. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that part. And I think Audrey is a great example. The conversations are important, but more important is the action. And if we're able to, decide when I'm not going to watch this and I'm going to get it this more pruned out way so that I have more time to act, I think is big too.
We are moving to the top of the hour, and it's gone too fast. I really enjoyed the conversation, but I wanted to give each of you in the Hangout sort of a learning or an impression or a takeaway, just any final thought or comment that you may have, starting with you, Audrey.
Yeah, I think that what you just said, Monica, was really great, and I think that that this call to action is really important for us to think about. But I think that it's important to remember that sort of writing is action, thinking is action. These are all doing and making things. Building community is action. I think that there are a lot of things that we can do in order to facilitate change. It doesn't necessarily have to look like pulling a lever in the voting booth or picketing in the streets. Those are all actions as well. But I think that sort of being a thoughtful member of the community is definitely a great action that any educator and learner can take.
Brian?
Here. I mean, I think we're really living in the age of the rise of the network. Steve, you asked us to remember historical contexts, and I think one story that always cheers me up is how the generation after Gutenberg, there was a movement to try to design printed books that looked like handwritten manuscripts. They're just hilarious to see now, but I think we're in that phase right now where people are trying to grapple with this by making it the old thing. So I think on the one hand, I agree totally with Monica and Audrey. This is the time for action, and I think all of us on this Hangout are embodiments of that, our own ways. But at the same time, I think we need to play the long game and realize that we are in an epoch of great transformation. And it's going to take some time for some of the changes to happen, for some of the towers to fall. But to do it in a networked way is the best.
Monica, then Steve.
Totally agree. And then would add a means to hasten this along is a simple feeling like it's legal to talk to ourselves every day and determine what matters to us, because that's where the change is going to happen if we individually start ourselves up.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Finish us off here.
So I just want to express appreciation to everybody who's working on these issues. All of the people who have thought about this, who are writing books, who are participating in conferences, who care. I mean, I think this is a really wonderful example of a dialogue around a compellingly important human issue, an issue that's existed for millennia. What is learning, and a profoundly important issue. And especially I want to express appreciation to those who are on this panel, because I think in many ways they are modeling the very things that I care about. They're individuals who've used their own learning to think about how to enhance learning for others, and are willing to step beyond their own personal motivations and potentially their own personal benefits to looking at a larger picture viewpoint and trying to figure out how we help others. And that's critical. And so thanks for having me on, and thanks to this panel for being here. Really a terrific group.
Yeah, I'll add my thanks to each of you. This is a conversation, and this group in particular, I'd love to keep going with. But we do have to close out. I want to remind everyone out there that Steve's webinar page at www.connectedlearning.tv later today will have a full recording of the webinar, a list of all the questions asked with timestamps, and then all of the resources that were mentioned. All of them will be included in that as well. And then we also want to welcome you to continue to share resources and ideas and comments and questions on that page, where Steve's webinar is. And I also want to let you know that at the Hub we have two strands of original research, one in connected learning and one in participatory politics and youth. And our Connected Learning Research Network has launched a survey study competition to show how youth are learning in connected learning environments. And the link for more information to possibly participate in that is in the live stream chat. It's bit.ly.clrnsurvey. Please take a look at that and see if that's something you'd be interested in. And then finally, our next session will be a week from today, Thursday, September 13th at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern. And it'll be a conversation with James Bosco, talking about the role and the nature of schooling in the 21st century. Thanks again, everybody, for I've taken a lot of notes. There's so many rich comments and quotes today that to deliberate on and help us go forward on. Talk to you later. See you next week, I hope. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Nice. Great.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.